Hello, and welcome to the Get the Trolls Out podcast series. In each episode, we invite inspiring individuals to share their work in combating discrimination and hate. Join us as we explore the initiatives that address religious hate speech and media biases and learn how you can get involved in creating a more inclusive world. Get the Trolls Out aims to counter discrimination and intolerance on religious grounds across the European media landscape. Led by MDI, the Media Diversity Institute, and in collaboration with 6 partner organisations, we harness the power of social media to promote dialogue and counter narratives to hate.
In line with Refugee Week, we have invited here with us today Anishkaa Worthington. She is a dedicated human rights advocate committed to supporting vulnerable individuals affected by domestic abuse, modern slavery, forced marriage, honour-based violence, sexual slavery, and abandonment. She holds a master's degree in conflict, security, and development from King's College London. Additionally, she is a prolific writer on human rights issues, contributing to various publications in the UK and Sri Lanka. Thank you, Anishkaa, for joining us today. Can you give us a little background into your work and your life in the UK?
Thank you for having me, Winnie and Rafana. It's so honored to be asked to do this. So I was born in the UK, and then when I was 5 years old, I moved to Sri Lanka. So I was born here because my father fled Sri Lanka in 1983, just a few months before the armed conflict began. So he fled to the UK because, in his own words, he told me when he was a young person, he only had 2 options had he stayed in Sri Lanka. They would have been, one, join the Tamil Tigers, the liberation of Tamil Tigers of Elam, or go to the capital, Colombo, try to get a job, try to get into university, but he wasn't able to because he was a Tamil man and he didn't know Sinhala, he couldn't afford to get a tutor, and had he gone there, he still would have been treated as a second-class citizen. So he thought that the best thing for him to do, for him to have a life, was to move abroad, and that's how he came to the UK. And as soon as he came to the UK, I think he would have been maybe 18 or 19. The first thing he did was start working, like take whatever work he could get. That would have been working in corner shop, things like that. And with whatever money he got, that was to put food on the table. And he would send that money back to his mother and his brothers and sisters back in Sri Lanka. When my grandmother was alive, she said that at the time, because it was a conflict zone, she would tear the mattress and hide the money inside because everyone was so scared. Like, it was such an unsafe time and people were so desperate. So she would hide the money inside the mattress just in case, if ever anyone was to break in or steal anything, they wouldn't be able to find it. And slowly with that money, my dad's siblings were also able to get an education and move abroad and eventually access safety. So it was quite a rebellious thing that he did. By taking me back to Sri Lanka when I was 5 years old. So when I moved there, we lived in Colombo, which was the capital, and we moved there in 2004. And at that time, Sri Lanka was in a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire between the Tamil Tigers and the government. However, the final stage of the war resumed in the latter years, and that continued on till May 2009. So although I wasn't living in a conflict zone, I was somewhat aware of what was going on. There were bombs around us, people were disappearing. It was just obvious that we were living in a very unsafe time. But unfortunately, that was the norm for me, my family, and my friends, for so many Sri Lankans. And then when the war ended in 2009, everyone was thrilled because the president at that time was promising us that everyone would be free because, there was no more armed struggle. The country had been liberated and so on. And that's what at the time we all believed. However, it was much later that I realized that I was actually living in an authoritarian regime. There was a lot of censorship happening around me. The first time I realized that was when I was 17, and I was applying to come to the UK to attend university. And I was doing a personal statement, and I was really interested in law. So I had reached out to an uncle of mine who ran an NGO, and I spent some time at his NGO to learn about, what human rights issues were, and like what was going on in Sri Lanka in terms of the political climate and so on. And when I wrote about my experiences, and one of the most important things I learned, that the people who I had always assumed were the bad guys, who were the terrorists, who were the villains, working at his NGO made me realize that actually these were also people who were very desperate and had been oppressed for so long, and they had chosen to fight because they saw that as the only way of, having some kind of control in their life. And they genuinely believed that this was the only way they could get freedom or some sense of equality. When I wrote about my personal perspective and also reconciliation with my own identity, because I'm Sri Lankan, but I'm half Sinhalese and half Tamil. And at the time, it was the Tamil Tigers were seeking liberation from the majority Sinhalese government. So when I wrote about all of this in my personal statement, I'm here thinking I did such a great job. And then my school called me up and said that they were refusing to send this personal statement off because they didn't agree with the things I'd said. I'd written about the lack of religious freedom in Sri Lanka, like how in certain Buddhist majority areas, for example, if you were a Christian or a Hindu, you were not allowed to bury your deceased loved ones on those grounds. The monks would interrupt the funerals and so on. So that's a lack of religious freedom in Sri Lanka. But when I wrote about it, my school said they didn't agree with it, and they were refusing to send my personal statement off. And that was the first time I realized the level of censorship I was surrounded by. And it was a very scary thing. I was really young at the time. All I wanted to do was to go to university. And I felt like my dreams were, being interrupted because I wasn't able to speak freely about what I had learned. So anyway, I moved to the UK, which was a bit of a culture shock for me, even though I've been to the UK many times before. But I think coming to the UK in 2017 as a university student suddenly made me very aware that for the first in my life, I was an immigrant, I can't tell you how disorienting that realization can be, because especially when you've grown up in your homeland, it is a privilege to grow up in your homeland. It is a privilege to be treated as an equal, as a genuine citizen in your own land, and then to move somewhere. One thing is to feel like a second class citizen in your own homeland, and then to move to another country where you feel so out of place. It's very disorienting, and unfortunately, not a lot of people understand how that feels. So when I moved to the UK, when I realized I was an immigrant, it was a sort of reality shock. But it was also a great opportunity for me to meet people, not only other Sri Lankans who had experiences that I never related to, but also, people from other countries who were, sharing their experiences of how they left. I made friends with, for example, a lot of my friends were Punjabi at the time, and their families had fled India because of the 1984 genocide then, or many had also fled expulsion in Africa, so in various countries where South Asians were being expelled in the 70s, and their families fled to the UK. So it was really interesting meeting people who, for the first time again, had a very similar experience to my own family, which I hadn't acknowledged when I was living in Sri Lanka. If anything, in Sri Lanka, it was a source of shame. Whereas when I came to the UK, I felt very proud of my family's, migrant history and, all the obstacles they had to overcome to make a name for themselves and to build a life for themselves. I don't think people realize that for a lot of migrant families, the fact that they own a car, that they own a home, that they have a mortgage, that they have a bank account in a foreign country is a very big deal, because those are things that a lot of people have been denied in their own home countries. So yeah, coming to the UK really opened my eyes in that sense. And then I was also really inspired by an area that I live really close to called Southall. And it's this incredible hub. It's known as Little India. And it became really, it's well known because back in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, so many South Asians, especially the Punjabi community, when they migrated to the UK, they settled in Southall. So when I do trips with my family just to like buy food, and look at the outfits and so on, I was really inspired by the incredible culture there, the migrant culture, because it now Southall is involved into a melting pot of not only Punjabis, not only the Punjabi community, but a group like thriving Somali community and a Tamil community. So I was really inspired by that, and I came across this organization that I now work for called Southall Black Sisters. It's a women's rights organization, and we support clients who are victims of gender-based violence. And I joined them in my final year of university as a volunteer. And through that work, I was meeting women who were fleeing domestic violence, forced marriage, honor based violence, all kinds of forms of gender based violence. But at the heart of it all, they were all from migrant backgrounds. And one of the biggest obstacles they were facing that was stopping them from accessing safety, their human right to safety, was their no recourse status, because they didn't have secure status in the UK. They were here as dependents on spouse visas, on, dependent visas, on student visas, visas that didn't allow them the freedom to access safety when they really needed to. And they were also dependent very much so on their abusers, which can make things 10 times scary and 10 times more difficult when trying to, flee a bad situation and become independent. And it was really interesting meeting these women. It was also very healing to my soul to be around people who are having the same experience I was, moving to the UK and trying to fit in, trying to navigate the lifestyle, but also trying to hold on to their roots and hold on to their individuality. But it made me realize that the difference between them and myself was that I had a lot of privilege. I had a lot of privilege because, I had a home to go to at the end of the day. I had access to a bank account. I had the I had the right to study and the right to work. And it made me realize that without those things, there was no difference between these women and I. I could have very easily come to the UK as a refugee myself, as an asylum seeker. I could have also been a victim of war. So that's what inspired me to work with refugees, asylum seekers, the migrant community.
Thank you for sharing this with us, Anishka. It was incredible to hear about your background and your life story. It fits into what I was about to ask you next. What kind of discrimination, particularly because of religion, do migrants and refugees face in your line of work?
Thank you, Fana. That's a really interesting question. I think at the end of the day, we are living in a post 9/11 world, and religion and race are massive factors in the way human beings are treated, and they also are defining factors of the UK's immigration policy. In my work, I've definitely come across, obviously, when you're a refugee, especially when you're an asylum seeker, you face immense amounts of discrimination, but the experience. And I think it's really interesting how, um, when we look at what was going on initially when the Russian invasion of Ukraine broke out, it was really interesting to see how, politicians were approaching the issue of immigration and the refugee crisis. And it was very surprising because they were speaking, they were saying words that they hadn't used to describe, for example, the Taliban taking over Afghanistan. When that broke out, refugees were seen as, a burden. There was talk of, locking down the borders in the UK to stop them from migrating. Whereas, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, Ukrainian refugees were being welcomed with open arms, as refugees should. But they were being opened with welcome arms into the UK. There were so many initiatives where people were like providing their own accommodation, so rooms in their homes, or like their garages for these refugees to take over. And these refugees were being provided homes in like places like Birmingham and Manchester. And it was a very smooth sailing process for them. So when looking at that experience, it made me think of, why were they treated so differently compared to, for example, the refugees that fled Afghanistan. I think one is the color of your skin, and the other is religion. And again, going back to living in a post 9/11 world, the West is terrified of Islam, and they have exaggerated it to be, the defining, threat of the West future, which is wrong. If you look at the stats, and especially if you look at the stats on the MI6 website, for example, the largest threat in terms of radicalization that the UK is facing is coming from the far right. But the media, politicians, these government institutions will have us believing that it's Muslims who are coming to the UK and who are, corrupting our children and radicalizing our teenagers and, destroying our neighborhoods and so on. So it's really interesting. I remember, again, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, a friend of mine who works at, who's a volunteer at Calais, she told me how like people there, so the refugees were trying to get into the UK, so cross Calais and come into the UK. Majority of them being, from, Muslim countries, so Somalia, Syria, and so on. They were actively being stopped to make room for Ukrainian refugees. The priority was being given to them. And I thought that was such a heartbreaking thing to hear, because it's so sad that we live in a world where religion, and especially Islam, has been weaponized and used as something so beautiful, and something so empowering for so many people has been taken and weaponized against them to stop them from having, a better life, from having a future, all because of their beliefs. And I think it's really interesting in terms of the work I do. I've found that, especially when it comes to religion, not just Islam, but other religions as well, where government institutions, no matter how hard they preach diversity, they don't put this into practice. So, for example, we have to look at what's happening in these asylum hotels. In a lot of asylum accommodation, people are given roommates, which is very understandable. But in those cases, it's leaving a lot of, Muslim, refugees and asylum seekers, especially Muslim women, vulnerable to sexual assault. And, it violates their privacy in so many ways. And the same thing in terms of food. We've heard so many stories and so many facts about, the food in these hotels and in these accommodation being completely inadequate. We need to be talking about, are these, are Muslim refugees being provided with halal meals? Are they, for example, Hindu refugees or Sikh refugees who majority follow a vegetarian diet? Are they, having access to what they require with, respect to their religious beliefs? So yeah, discrimination is, very rampant. I mean, I see how it's interesting. I was reading up on this, and the article discussed how immigration officers are trained to pick up on red flags in asylum applications. So, for example, in my church, we've built a small community of Iranian refugees, and they fled Iran because they were unable to practice Christianity. They were at risk of persecution. That's why they fled, and they're now seeking asylum in the UK. And they, in this article, it spoke about how immigration officers will go through statements from these asylum seekers, and they'll look into things of, so for example, let's say this this person has come from a Muslim majority country, but he or she, or they are claiming that they have now converted to Christianity. That's their choice. But these immigration officers are looking into aspects of like, oh, when did they convert? What motivated them to convert? What place of worship do they go to? Do they go regularly? What do the congregational members say? Not just a letter from the Church of England or a priest is good enough. These immigration officers are doing deep dives into these, asylum seekers and refugees' personal histories, which I find so sad. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know anywhere. I don't know any other person in this world that is held accountable for their own actions or their own beliefs as an asylum seeker is. And I find that really appalling. So yeah, we're seeing in terms of religion just growing discrimination.
Thank you for that, Anishka. We just want to, deep dive a little bit into the work you're doing because you said you work with migrants, and I wondered if you could share a bit about your, whatever you feel comfortable with, of course, to share with us what kind of discrimination migrant women face in the UK, and what kind of religious experiences they've had or religious freedom that they've had that they can practice their identity, fully. If you can tell us a little bit, that'll be nice.
Thank you so much, Amy. So it is a privilege to work with these women, but my heart goes out to them for the horrific experiences they go through. With the work I do, I've spoken to clients who have disclosed that when living in these asylum hotels or asylum accommodation, sexual assault is now becoming normalized. It's really unsafe for these women because they are being assaulted by other asylum seekers and also the staff in the hotel. I've spoken to clients who say that they don't even think about reporting it to the police. One, because they still have that fear of authority, especially when they're coming from countries where corruption is incredibly vast. So they don't trust the idea that the police or their bodies out there to protect them is completely unheard of. But it's also that fear that it will harm the application, and it will be they will be blamed. They will be seen as the instigator, and that will stop them from getting secure status in the UK. So they believe that the only way they can carry on is to keep quiet. And it's just atrocious at the stories I've heard, especially of children. Children are being subjected to sexual assault. Children are being, physically harmed again by staff or, other asylum seekers. They're being confined, like women and children are being confined to rooms where they spend the whole day. They don't have, access to open spaces or things like that. So the issue, a lot of the work I do is related to the issue of no recourse to public funds. So let me just give you some, like an overview into what happens to an asylum seeker when they claim asylum in the UK. So when someone claims asylum in the UK, and they need accommodation, the Home Office will provide them with accommodation. Firstly, in usually an asylum hotel, and at this stage, they're not given any money. They're provided with 3 meals a day by the hotel, and most often these meals are not adequate at all. It's only later that they eventually graduate to receiving an Aspen card where money will be deposited into that card. So it's usually, I think now the amount is around £49 and something pence. There was a time when it was just, around £30. But yeah, this is what an asylum seeker will get per week, which I think, again, living in this cost of living crisis that's extremely difficult to get by. So even when they get this little money, it's really difficult for them to live a life of dignity. So, for example, even being able to, let's say, go to a park, things like that. Jumping on a bus and paying that £1.75 is something that you and I may think twice about, but an asylum seeker is thinking about way more than that, because that money for them could be used for something else, and there's no, it's not that they can make it up easily. They're not working, they're not, earning from anywhere else. So, it's very, it is difficult to see how people are having to forego their human dignity, to accommodate these rules. So especially, yeah, these women are going through, sexual assault. They're not being fed properly. They're not receiving, proper nutrition. Although they're living in the UK and they're receiving these meals, a lot of these refugees and asylum seekers are living in food poverty. They don't have the money to afford meals. So that's why they're eating, sandwiches and, pasta, very basic meals. But where's the nutrition in that? How is that, especially for someone who has health issues, how is that helping them get better? How is that helping them get stronger? Even to take an antibiotic, you need to have a full meal. You need to be taking that on a full stomach. Whereas for a lot of these asylum seekers and refugees, they're going hungry. Um, yeah. And then in terms of the religious experiences that they have faced, I do feel that from what clients have disclosed to me, they do find it difficult to exercise their faith in many ways. For example, them again going to a mosque or going to a temple, especially a place where they feel safe in, where they, feel closer to their community. It is difficult to travel. It's, getting across London or whatever city they're in and going to that place of worship. They feel excluded, especially when it's, around a religious festival time, because they can't, access the transport. They can't access the things they need to be present in those spaces. And also, again, with the housing crisis, with, asylum seekers having to share, a room, sharing facilities, they sometimes don't have the privacy to even pray on their own. They'll be praying in front of their roommate, which is understandable. But I think obviously we as humans, we all would love our alone time. So it's again a life where they are forced to, constantly be under surveillance, constantly be under supervision. Speaking to someone that I know, based on her experience of being an asylum seeker, that's what she said. She just felt like she was constantly surveilled. And when she became a refugee, even though that allowed her to, claim benefits, get housing, and so on, she couldn't shake that feeling of being constantly watched and having to explain every single move she made. And so, yeah, and also in terms of, with but going back to what I was saying about how, for example, in my church, I see how a lot of asylum seekers fled their homes because they weren't able to practice their faith, and because they were at risk of persecution. It's interesting how it's interesting to meet clients and hear the feedback that the lawyer, the few who are lucky to have access to a lawyer, the advice they're getting. So, for example, they are being advised to convert to Christianity or Catholicism because that will make them more appealing to the Home Office. And it's really sad that, again, these government institutions will have their biases, whether known or unknown, because apparently being Christian or Catholic makes them makes them more appealing. It makes them less threatening. I think, it reminds me of, the conversations that like journalists were having on TV about the Ukrainian refugees, and they were comparing them to, the Israel-Gaza crisis. And I remember one journalist, she was Ukrainian, she was saying how, Ukrainian children should be favored. They're not the same as Palestinian children because Palestinian children are terrorists. They're radicals. I thought it was so sad again how religion had been weaponized. The fact that these children were Muslim, that automatically made them terrorists, that automatically made them extremists, that made them violent. Whereas Ukrainian children, she was saying, because they're Christian, they're more loving and they are more likely, as in they're easy to accept and so on. So that bias is very much present in our, immigration policy.
Thank you for that, Anishka. I think this kind of sits really well into the next question I had for you, which was about media coverage of migrants and the effect it probably has on a migrant, and what are the different ways in which you think the media can improve in their representation of this community.
Yeah, I think the thing is with the media follows trends. I think we're all aware of that, and especially you guys doing the work you do. The thing is, the media hasn't created a safe space in the UK for asylum seekers, refugees, or migrants in general. If anything, they have aggravated the hate towards them by, quoting politicians who are, asking these migrants to leave, to get out, to be deported. So how does someone living in the UK, how do they feel hopeful for the future? How do they feel optimistic when everywhere they go, they're hearing that they're unwanted? So the thing is with the media, it's not representative of the general population. At the end of the day, the UK is a melting pot of cultures. We're all immigrants in one way or the other. But the media only gives a voice to that 1%, and they don't hear the rest of us. Whereas, you know, um, the media hasn't, taken into account the horrific things that people are fleeing from, and they're not regard. And it's interesting. I don't think the media regards, migrants or asylum seekers or refugees as human beings, but rather, they regard them as a headline, or they regard them as, an object that they can use for abuse. They're not, I remember when the Rwanda bill was released, and the media coverage on that about how Sunak has introduced this act to stop the boats. I think the way the media framed that whole angle, it was very much, I thought it was very specific to a certain migrant population. We have to think about who are the people that come on board. Certainly not refugees from Europe. Certainly not refugees of certain stature, of certain religions, of certain ethnicities. It's people who are coming from who are fleeing conflict, who are fleeing very dangerous situations. It is a desperate move to put yourself on a boat, and it's not an easy journey. I've spoken to clients who have been on these boats, and it's hard, it's terrifying, especially women. They're at risk of being exploited by human traffickers. They're being separated from loved ones. They're being they're dodging sexual assault every second. They're seeing, people drown. They're seeing people get left behind. They're seeing people get killed. They're seeing people get misled. It is certainly not an easy. It's the hardest plight someone has to take. And I wish that not only the media, but the government institutions, policymakers, they understand that for someone to put their life at risk, it is for a genuine reason. They're genuinely wanting to have a better life, to have a better future.
Thank you, Anishka. I think we've heard some really interesting points from you today, especially because of your background personally and professionally. And I'm sure our listeners have enjoyed it. I would like to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. And I thank all our listeners. Please stay tuned to know more about our Refugee Week campaign this week. You can find more information on our website. And thank you.